Admit it or not, China has grown into the world's second largest economy and the world's largest trading nation in goods. It is the largest trading partner to more than 130 countries.
Beijing calls the refusal of the European Parliament to grant China market economy status non-constructive. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. The European Parliament has refused for now to grant China market economy status in the World Trade Organization. Many lawmakers there oppose it, in part because they consider Chinese steel production a threat to European jobs. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001 with the belief it might be granted market economy status by the end of the year. For Europe's second largest trading partner, membership would make it easier to export goods to the European Union's 28-member bloc.
We hope that the European side can adopt an objective view towards China's development and respect the rule of the game of the World Trade Organization and respect the judicial obligation provided for in international documents. Our two parties always promote the spirit of openness, liberty, free exchange, honesty, and the rule of law.
Joining us now from Beijing is Xu Zitao. He's the chief economist for the financial consulting group Deloitte China. With us from London is Keiyu Jin. She's a professor of economics at the London School of Economics. Also with us from Brussels is Duncan Freeman. He's a senior research fellow at the Brussels Diplomatic Academy and the Brussels Academy for Chinese and European Studies. And with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Philippe Lecourt. He's a visiting fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution and the co-author of China's Offensive in Europe. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Xu Zitao, let's start with what is a market economy status and why is it so important to China?
It's important for China because it's really about recognition of China's opening and reform since China's accession into the WTO. So without that recognition, China would have felt somewhat snubbed by Europe. The second reason is really about trade. So without that status, Chinese product would have encountered more resistance in the market, particularly against the backdrop of global economy in such doldrum.
Keiyu Jin, there are already more than 80 countries that recognize China's status as a market economy, and these countries include Russia, Brazil, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. Why the reluctance on the part of the EU?
I think that some of the countries that you mentioned are, many of them are emerging markets, developing countries. They are embracing more globalization, both on the trade side and the investment side, and we have seen that China has invested recently a lot in Australia. Now, Europe has its own domestic economic issues, and I think one of the domestic pressures is, regarding China's steel industry or these manufacturing industries, which are perceived to be stealing jobs away from European workers themselves. This obviously is a bit of a misperception. One, for the very simple reason that China is actually restructuring its economy away from massive producing industrial goods and manufacturing into more consumer-oriented products and services. And this is actually where greater openness and greater trade between Europe and China can help both countries. Now, the turning protectionist kind of trend, we've seen that in the political debate in the US, and unfortunately Europe is moving towards that as well in responding to some of its economic issues, but actually this is, if anything, it would exacerbate the European economic problems by not embracing China in a more global economy.
Duncan, the European Parliament has passed a non-binding resolution to call on the European Commission, that's the executive branch of the EU, not to grant market economy status to China. And lawmakers have been expressing their concerns about EU industry, about jobs. So is this debate in part about jobs here?
Well, I think in Brussels, certainly it is very much about jobs, and it's about concerns in certain countries and certain sectors which are seen by their constituency as being under threat from China, from competition from China. But it's also important to remember that this is not something which affects all trade between the EU and China. It only affects a very small percentage of trade between the EU and China. The percentage of trade which is subject potentially to anti-dumping duties, which is generally less than 2% of EU imports from China. So it is actually a big political issue, but in the wider context of the EU-China trading relationship, it only affects a small part of the trade.
Philip, you've written extensively about Chinese investments in your book, China's Offensive in Europe. What makes Europe so attractive for Chinese investors?
Well, Europe has a lot of brands, for a start, and technology, and Europe is a market, and that's where it's bringing us back to this subject. China has launched a sort of going out policy in the late 90s and encouraged state-owned enterprises and also private companies to invest in Europe, and it's worked quite well in terms of numbers, and last year was a jump of 44%, for example. So China is certainly interested in developing a strong economic partnership with Europe, although there are many problems, I must say, including the lack of market access in China itself for European companies. So the debate is somewhat shifting now from a very sort of China-friendly Europe to a more sort of mixed attitude, and I think the European Parliament vote reflects this, as 80% of the MEPs who are democratically elected by Europeans decided to go against this market economy status. And I have to say, when I look at the EU definition of a non-market economy, it says that one of the criteria involves a low degree of governmental influence over the allocation and resources and decisions of enterprises, which is probably not a criteria for Chinese state-owned enterprises, in particular when they do business with the rest of the world. So that all these kind of things, and including the fact 70% of the Chinese FDIs in Europe are state-owned and backed by state banks and sovereign funds. All this is somewhat worrying to a number of European politicians.
Xu Sitao, there are at least 3 European countries, France, Spain, and Italy, of course all members of the European Union, who say that giving China this status, a market economy status, will result in Europe being flooded with cheap goods. Is that a valid concern?
Not really, but in the short term, I do think in certain European countries they are quite worried about China's steel industry, which is being plagued by overcapacity. So if you look at China's export of steel in past 2 years, we have seen this surge of export volume. At the same time, the value of exports actually went down. So that was the argument, I think, used by many European countries because on the ground of anti-dumping. So, I mean, steel industry is always very sensitive in Europe. If you understand the history of European Union starting after World War II. So this is a particularly sensitive area. But I don't think you can use a sweeping statement to describe many other industries.
Keyu Jin, there are critics of this. They're like industrial lobbyists, trades unions, and they complain that China uses government subsidies to support exports, and that undermines overseas competition. What do you make of those complaints?
Well, I think it is to some degree true, although the intention originally was not completely deliberate. The Chinese model so far since the 1980s has been about industrialization, because there is a mental bias that industrialization is tantamount to modernization. So subsidizing the firms with cheap labor and cheap capital obviously gives these firms a head start in terms of exporting cheap goods, but actually the entity that's the agents who are actually subsidizing these firms are not really the government. It comes down to the households, because the households are earning almost zero on their savings, and also they are the ones who supply labor, and wages have not been climbing as rapidly as their productivity. So I think conceptually it's just part of the Chinese growth model in terms of letting firms and production and investment thrive at the cost of consumption. Now, it's not a deliberate strategy for the government to directly subsidize firms, Chinese firms, to export abroad. I think that would be a misinterpretation, although that is partly true. Of course, China has many other things, let's keep in mind, not just cheap labor, not just cheap capital, but also fantastic infrastructure, human resources. Compared to a lot of developing countries, it does have a natural comparative advantage. So I think to some degree, it's a mixture of both. But as I was emphasizing a little bit earlier, China is restructuring. This is a very clear strategy, and it would be a mistake not to embrace China in the new economic model in terms of synergies between technology, capital, and brands. This is where Europe would stand a great chance.
Right, Philip?
Well, I'm afraid, China is really clearly not a market economy at the moment. All the figures and all the signs, every economist agree that, there's not enough economic freedom for private businesses. On the other hand, if you look at things from a European point of view, we're talking about 200,000 jobs at stake in the steel industry. And Europe is facing many problems, economic, social, political, elections coming up, that's also a factor. But surely nobody wants to see 200,000 jobs disappearing, including in the UK, which is facing a general election, a referendum on the EU very soon. So it's a debate that unfortunately will have to be solved in a different way, not by granting the market economy status, perhaps using mitigating measures, or perhaps not granting the market economy status to China. But I don't think it's going to happen this year. The European Parliament vote, it was very clear. The final vote will be as clear as we saw a couple of weeks ago. And I think whatever the European Commission might say, the politics will actually decide in the end.
Duncan, at the...
Could I just jump in?
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Kay.
Sorry. Just one about the market economy. Now, there are two issues. First of all, there's state capitalism. Now, I think that certain countries, such as Singapore, such as China, will remain to operate under state capitalist mode. Not every country has to have the same kind of market economy. Singapore has never been part of this this debate. Now, if a market economy is about very little government intervention, we certainly cannot say that about Europe, or to some degree the US either. So I think we have to come to the terms that good trading partners, great trading partners, something that would have a win-win situation for both sides, will have to be more tolerant in terms of what kind of economic scheme under which it operates. And so I would beg to say that, beg to defer in terms of saying that a lot of the prices are revealing huge market dynamics in China. Certain kind of government subsidies here and there in different industries happen across all around the world. But I would go far to say that Chinese market economy in many sectors, many industries, both domestically and internationally, really symbolize a very free market economy. The prices will reveal many things. So I think we have to slightly question and not sweep under the rug, what do we really mean by market economy? Because if it's all about government intervention, that would apply to a lot of other countries.
Right, all a question of definition. Duncan, you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to say something quite similar, that I think we shouldn't be too focused simply on the words market economy status, which can lead us into endless, rather philosophical debates about what exactly is a market economy, which don't deal with what is actually an essentially political problem. And I think even in the European Parliament, although the vote was saying that at the present moment China should not have market economy status, in fact it was leaving quite a lot of wriggle room for the Commission to find a solution, because what it also said was that any solution would have to be WTO compliant. And there is a possibility, and a quite serious one, that under the WTO, China would get its status as a non-market economy removed at the end of this year. And so the European Union would have to deal with that situation where the WTO considers effectively China to be a market economy, and the solution that the EU would have to come up with would have to be compliant with that. Otherwise, and it's quite clear that this would probably happen, China will directly challenge the European Union at the WTO and has a reasonable chance, probably, of winning its case. And so that is a serious political problem that the European Union and China together have to solve.
Okay, I want to continue with those issues that you raised, but first we're going to have to take a break. More of our conversation on China's market economy status after this. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the resolution by the European Parliament to deny China market economy status. Let's get back to our panel. And I'm going to get back to Xu Sitao. Xu, a moment ago, Duncan was talking about the fact that the World Trade Organization might declare China a market economy and that Europe would then have to follow. Do you believe that to be the case?
Probably, but at the same time, I think it's in China's best interest to work with Europe, because to achieve some sort of compromise, to take steel industry as an example and some other industries, because China's size, we cannot compare China with other emerging markets. Because the colossal size of various industries, if China is not making money in certain sectors, no country actually would make money in that sector. That's the perfect example of steel industry. Therefore, actually to accelerate consolidation in steel industry is also in China's best interest.
What does China want in Europe? There is already a bilateral treaty, right?
There isn't, but I would certainly agree with what has just been said. What is China's best interest in Europe? There is obviously a move by Chinese companies into Europe in many sectors, not just steel, but also automobile, energy, transport, the running of harbors and ports and airports and highways. So obviously there are many interests at stake, including a political interest. I mean, I'm sitting here from Washington, where of course the mood is quite different when it comes to China. In Europe, there's a sort of a wide range of players, including the European Union institutions and individual countries, and they're all talking to China separately or together in many issues, and perhaps not the issues that annoy China the most, for example, the South China Sea or human rights or Tibet. So in a way, China has developed this relationship with the EU and wants to continue, wants to keep it. And one of the things that it needs to achieve if it wants to continue this sort of long-range and wide relationship with Europe is a bilateral investment treaty. Now, the problem, as I said earlier, is the market access in China has not been as good as it was in a number of sectors. And European companies, as the European Chamber of Commerce has been saying for the past few years, have been complaining about the lack of access. So there's a kind of a discrepancy between the European access and the lack of market access. And therefore, the market economy status, which is of course a technical issue, is somewhat linked to all this. So a lot of people are saying, well, let's go ahead and finalize this bilateral investment treaty. And then we can move on with other things, including the market economy status and including, a wide range partnership. And by the way, there will be an EU-China summit again in a few weeks. And I suspect, investment will be on top of the list, and market economy status will be as well.
Right, Kay, talking about investment, Chinese foreign direct investment in the EU is something like, what, $55 billion annually. And we look at some of the other figures that China has invested in and set up more than 2,000 companies that directly employ 74,000 European workers. Now, wouldn't that suggest that Chinese investment in Europe actually saves jobs?
Yes, I think the danger of using anecdotes such as the steel industry, as just has been said, is that it's not overall representative of the situation. So I think China right now has a lot of capital to export. Among the other things such as steel, it also has a lot of capital freely to invest in infrastructure and other wide range of industries in Europe, and it is interested in doing so. Europe's economic woes would be partly resolved by welcoming more investment where there is not enough domestic savings. So I think all of this are positive things for Europe as a whole, and we need to move beyond just certain kind of traded goods, certain kind of manufacturing industries into overall general investment both ways. And so I think I see huge potential in terms of Chinese investment in Europe, in terms of synergies, in terms of opening up the Chinese market, by the way, to the Europeans. There is a lot much more to be done. So in the way, of course, it brings capital. It will also create jobs. It is difficult to say what the net employment related to China is. But we have to understand that in this increasingly globalized world, bilateral trade, bilateral investment, greater global cooperation is ultimately a good thing, and it is very fortunate that advanced economy part of the world, including the U.S., is turning more protectionist.
Duncan, what about that point that KU makes? What about exports from Europe to China?
Well, certainly that is very important in the economic relationship and is becoming more and more important. European exports to China have been growing very rapidly in recent years, although one of the problems for the European Union is that it's a bit wrong to simply take Europe as a whole, because in fact Germany tends to benefit much more from the trading relationship with China than other member states. Last year Germany accounted for over 40% of EU exports to China. But there are important relationships with other member states, and I think that's where it's important to remember that perhaps although the European Parliament voted with a very large majority against granting market economy status to China at the moment, it's not entirely representative of the EU-China economic relationship, and it's certainly not very representative of the opinion more broadly on the EU-China relationship, because there are sectors and industries and member states in the European Union that benefit much more than others from the relationship, and they have a very different view of the relationship. The member states that tend to be more negative about the relationship tend to be the southern European ones, which perhaps for as much for domestic reasons and for reasons within the Eurozone as anything else, tend to be much more or much less competitive in the global economy, and suffer much more from globalization in general than the more competitive economies like Germany, like the Netherlands, Sweden, and to some extent the UK as well. So the opinion within Europe on the relationship with China is actually much more diverse than is reflected by that one single vote in the European Parliament.
If I just may add a point on this, yes, Germany is certainly China's largest European partner and trade partner, and certainly a lot of investment. Not the prime recipient of Chinese investment in Europe, though. But there is also a kind of interesting phenomenon going on in Germany with public opinion that is quite anti-Chinese, really. 28% only of positive opinions for China in Germany, which is by far, the most negative in all of the EU. And people are wondering why. I mean, the other country being Italy, which is a large recipient of Chinese FDI. So China has an image problem in Europe. And whatever happens, I mean, the German government and local MPs or MEPs, for that matter, have to take into account, a diversity of opinions when it comes to China. The Chinese model, nobody doubts that China has done a great job over the past 30 years. The Chinese economy has been a great success, although it's slowing down. But you know, the Europeans as a people don't really recognize China as a model for the future of the world. You know, in terms of societal model as well as economic model. So I think China needs to do a bit more improvement on this, and the economic links will continue. Chinese investments are welcome in Europe and should be welcome. But granting the market economic status is certainly something to be looked at in details, and I think we're going to have to find a compromise there.
Kay, what do you think that?
If I could just add one more thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, if I could add one point, which is that the negative image about China stealing jobs, there's a lot of that going on around the world. But interestingly enough, China has been exporting cheaper products, apparel, sneakers, all these kind of things, cheaper consumer products to the rest of the world, and export a certain degree of deflation along with India that never gets talked about. So the Chinese households are subsidizing American households to produce cheaper products for them. So that kind of, talking about image, I think the negative image in a lot of these countries largely hinges upon what the media decides, what kind of message it decides to convey. But funnily enough, we have done in academia a lot of studies on the Chinese impact on consumer products and consumer inflation in many of these countries to have had a significant impact, but none of this kind of message gets across either.
Xu Zitao, is there a compromise in the works here if China is not granted market economy status?
I think a compromise is very much needed. First of all, I think given the size of China, I'm not using any anecdotal evidence. Today, if you look at the market share of Chinese product in developed countries, including Europe, the size is about 15 to 20%. So I think certain protectionism is expected anyway, because the size is too big. Secondly, for certain industries in China, I think a consolidation is long overdue. It's in China's best interest. Thirdly, if we allow foreign competition, open up certain sectors, for example, 10 years ago, perhaps we would not have such excess capacity in certain industries, because in the end, overcapacity is caused by government intervention. So it's necessary for China to do that. But at the same time, we must recognize the fact, due to historical reasons, the role being played by the Chinese government very often is dominant. So you cannot take the government out of the equation. Therefore, consolidation can only take place in a measured manner in many industries. Therefore, a compromise is very much needed between China and Europe.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.